Sometimes, in the span of a single heartbeat, everything you thought you knew about someone can shift completely. Picture this: a grand hall filled with hundreds of people, cameras rolling, the weight of tradition pressing down like a heavy blanket. Then, in one unguarded moment, a gesture so unexpected, so raw with emotion, that it stops time itself. What you're about to discover isn't just another royal story. It's about the precise moment when a king chose his heart over protocol, when years of carefully constructed public image crumbled away to reveal something achingly human underneath. This is the story of how one reach, one touch, one split-second decision in front of the entire world changed not just a family, but an entire nation's understanding of love, loss, and what it truly means to be human. The silence that followed would echo through palaces and living rooms alike, leaving everyone asking the same impossible question. What happens when duty collides with the deepest corners of the human heart? The morning of the Commonwealth Day service dawned crisp and clear, the kind of London day that made the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey seem to glow with inner light. Charles stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his ceremonial uniform for the third time. His reflection showed a man who had grown into his role as king, the weight of the crown having settled across his shoulders with surprising comfort. Yet this morning, something felt different. There was an unsettled energy in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Camilla emerged from her dressing room, resplendent in deep purple silk, her composure as perfectly arranged as her hair. She had mastered the art of royal presence over the years, learning to carry herself with the quiet confidence that the public expected from their queen consort. Her smile was warm, but measured as she approached her husband. "You seem distracted this morning," she observed, her voice carrying that gentle concern that had become second nature after decades of marriage. Charles turned from the mirror, his eyes focusing on her, but seeming to look through her at the same time. "Just thinking about the day ahead," he replied, though his mind was actually wandering to a conversation he'd had with William the previous evening. His son had looked tired, more tired than a man his age should look, and it had stirred something protective in Charles's chest. The pressures of being heir, of maintaining the delicate balance between public duty and private life, were taking their toll on the younger generation in ways that Charles recognized all too well. The drive to Westminster Abbey passed in relative quiet, both Charles and Camilla lost in their own thoughts as London rolled past the windows of their state car. The streets were lined with well-wishers, their faces bright with the peculiar joy that royal occasions seemed to bring out in people. Charles waved mechanically, his smile practiced and genuine enough, but his mind was elsewhere. Inside the Abbey, the great and good of the Commonwealth had assembled. Dignitaries from 54 nations filled the ancient pews, their collective presence creating an atmosphere thick with tradition and expectation. The stone walls had witnessed centuries of such gatherings, each one adding another layer to the complex tapestry of British royal history. William and Kate arrived precisely on schedule, their entrance causing the subtle shift in energy that always accompanied their presence. Kate moved with that effortless grace that had made her beloved around the world, her emerald green coat perfectly tailored, her smile warm and authentic. William walked beside her, his posture straight and shoulders squared, but Charles noticed the tightness around his son's eyes, the way his jaw was set just a fraction too firmly. The family took their places in the front pews, arranged according to protocol that had been refined over generations. Charles sat between Camilla and William, with Kate beside her husband. The positioning was deliberate, designed to present the image of a united royal family to the watching world. Yet as the service began, Charles found himself acutely aware of the spaces between them, the careful distances that protocol demanded. The Archbishop's voice filled the soaring space as he began the service, his words about unity and fellowship echoing off the medieval stones. Charles followed along with the familiar rhythms of the ceremony, but part of his attention remained fixed on his family. He could sense Kate's presence beside William, could feel the slight tension in his son's posture. There was something in the air between them, something that spoke of recent conversations held in low voices, of pressures that the public would never see. As the first hymn began, the congregation's voices rising in harmonious tradition, Charles noticed Kate's hand trembling slightly as she held her order of service. It was almost imperceptible, the kind of detail that only someone watching closely would catch. But Charles had spent decades learning to read the subtle signs of stress in public settings, and he recognized what he was seeing. The service continued with its stately progression of readings and prayers, each element carefully choreographed to reinforce the themes of Commonwealth unity and royal continuity. Charles played his part perfectly, rising and sitting at the appropriate moments. His response is clear and confident. But underneath the surface performance, he was increasingly aware of an undercurrent of emotion that seemed to be building like pressure in a sealed chamber. During the second reading, delivered by a young woman from Jamaica whose clear voice rang with conviction, Charles glanced sideways at Kate. She was listening intently, but he could see the slight flush in her cheeks, the way she was breathing just a little too carefully. William, beside her, seemed focused on the service, but Charles caught the moment when his son's hand moved slightly toward Kate's, then stopped, held back by some invisible barrier. The realization hit Charles with unexpected force. This wasn't just about the pressures of royal duty or the weight of public expectation. There was something more personal happening here, something between his son and daughter-in-law that was causing them both obvious distress. The protective instinct that had guided him through his own difficult years as heir suddenly flared to life. As the congregation settled into their seats after the final hymn before the sermon, Charles found himself studying Kate's profile. She had always reminded him of Diana in some ways, not in appearance, but in that quality of genuine warmth that seemed to radiate from her even in the most formal settings. Diana had struggled with the constraints of royal life, had sometimes seemed to be drowning in expectations and protocols that felt impossible to navigate. Was Kate experiencing something similar? The Archbishop began his sermon, his words about service and sacrifice taking on new meaning as Charles watched his family from the corner of his eye. Camilla sat perfectly still beside him, her attention apparently focused entirely on the preacher's words. But Charles was increasingly consumed by the sense that something important was happening in this moment, something that went beyond the formal requirements of the occasion. Kate shifted slightly in her seat, and Charles saw William's hand tense on his knee, saw the moment of hesitation before his son reached over to touch his wife's arm briefly. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but Charles could see the effort it required, could sense that whatever was troubling them was creating a distance that they were both struggling to bridge. The service moved toward its climax, the moment when Charles would be called upon to deliver brief remarks to the assembled congregation. He had prepared carefully for this speech, working with his staff to craft words that would reinforce the themes of unity and shared purpose that the occasion demanded. But as he sat there, surrounded by the pageantry and tradition that had shaped his entire life, he found himself questioning whether the carefully chosen words would be enough. As the Archbishop introduced him, Charles rose to make his way to the lectern. The congregation settled into expectant silence. Hundreds of faces turned toward him with the mixture of respect and curiosity that always accompanied royal pronouncements. He reached the lectern, adjusted his notes, and looked out over the assembled crowd. But instead of beginning his prepared remarks immediately, Charles found his gaze drawn back to where his family sat. William was watching him with the dutiful attention of an heir, but Charles could see the tension still held in his son's shoulders. Kate was looking up at him too, and in her eyes, he caught a glimpse of something that made his chest tighten with recognition. It was the same look he remembered from his own early years of marriage, the expression of someone trying very hard to hold everything together while feeling increasingly fragile underneath. The moment stretched longer than it should have, the silence in the abbey becoming noticeable. Charles was supposed to begin speaking, but something was holding him back, some instinct that whispered that this moment was more important than any speech he might give. The prepared words suddenly seemed hollow, inadequate for what was really needed here. In the front pew, Kate's composure flickered for just an instant, and Charles saw something that looked almost like a plea in her expression. It wasn't directed at him specifically, but rather seemed to be a general appeal to the universe for understanding, for some relief from whatever burden she was carrying. William must have seen it too, because Charles watched his son's hand move again toward his wife, then stop, held back by the invisible constraints of their very public setting. Charles gripped the edges of the lectern, his prepared speech forgotten as he wrestled with an impulse that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Every instinct trained by decades of royal duty told him to proceed with the ceremony as planned, to deliver his remarks and maintain the careful order that such occasions required. But something stronger was pulling at him, something that spoke to the father and grandfather he was beneath the formal role of king. The congregation waited, the silence stretching into something that was beginning to feel significant. In palaces and living rooms around the world, television cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it live to millions of viewers who were beginning to sense that something unexpected was happening. This was supposed to be a routine royal engagement, a familiar ritual carried out with the practiced ease that the family had perfected over generations. But, as Charles stood at that lectern, looking out at his family and feeling the weight of their unspoken struggles, he realized that this moment was anything but routine. Something was asking to be acknowledged here, something that went beyond the formal requirements of duty and protocol. And, for the first time in his life as a royal, Charles found himself wondering whether the most important choice he could make was not the safe one, not the expected one, but the one that honored the human hearts beating beneath all the ceremony and tradition. The silence continued to build, pregnant with possibility and fraught with risk. In that suspended moment, with hundreds of people watching and millions more around the world waiting to see what would happen next, Charles felt the full weight of who he was and who he was expected to be pressing down on him like a physical force. But stronger than that pressure was the pull of love, of family, of the recognition that sometimes the most profound acts of leadership require abandoning the script entirely. He looked down at his notes one more time, then, slowly, deliberately, set them aside. Whatever was about to happen, Charles knew it would change everything. The question was whether he had the courage to let it. The decision crystallized in Charles's mind with startling clarity. He stepped back from the lectern, his movement causing a ripple of confusion through the congregation. This wasn't part of the program. The archbishop, seated nearby, looked up with barely concealed alarm, his eyebrows rising slightly as he tried to understand what was happening. But Charles was no longer thinking about protocol or procedure. He was thinking about Kate's eyes, about the fragility he'd glimpsed there, and about his son's carefully controlled distance. "Your Royal Highnesses, distinguished guests," Charles began, his voice carrying easily through the soaring space. "Today we gather to celebrate the bonds that unite our Commonwealth family. But before we speak of distant connections, perhaps we should acknowledge the ones closest to us." The words weren't in his prepared speech. They came from somewhere deeper, from a place that had been building pressure for months without him fully realizing it. In the front pew, William straightened slightly, sensing that something significant was happening. Camilla's perfectly composed expression flickered for just a moment, uncertainty crossing her features like a cloud shadow. "I have spent my life learning about duty," Charles continued, his gaze moving deliberately to where his family sat. "About the weight of expectation and the importance of maintaining traditions that have guided us for generations. But today, in this sacred place, I find myself thinking not about duty, but about love, about family, about the courage it takes to reach across the spaces that protocol creates between us." Kate's breathing had become very still, very controlled. She was looking up at him with an expression that Charles recognized from his own children when they were young and uncertain, when they needed reassurance but weren't sure how to ask for it. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. She was drowning in exactly the same way Diana had once drowned, caught between who she naturally was and who the world expected her to be. The congregation was absolutely silent now, hundreds of people holding their breath as they sensed that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Royal speeches were supposed to be predictable, carefully crafted statements that reinforced established themes. This felt different. This felt personal. "We often speak of the Commonwealth as a family of nations," Charles said, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. "But families are not built on distance and formality. They are built on moments of connection, on the willingness to see each other's humanity even when the whole world is watching." He paused, letting the words settle into the ancient stones around them. In that pause, Charles made a choice that would ripple outward in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Instead of returning to his prepared remarks, instead of steering back toward safe territory, he chose to follow the truth that was burning in his chest. "My son William and his wife Catherine have carried themselves with grace and dedication that has made our entire nation proud," he said, and now his voice carried a warmth that was unmistakably paternal. "But today I see them not as the future of the monarchy, but as two young people who have given everything to serve others, sometimes at great personal cost." William's composure cracked almost imperceptibly. His jaw tightened, and Charles saw his son's hand move instinctively toward Kate's, then stop, constrained by decades of training about appropriate public behavior. In that hesitation, Charles saw everything he needed to know about what his son and daughter-in-law were struggling with. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every nuance of the moment. In editing rooms and newsrooms around the world, producers were beginning to realize that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a deviation from protocol. It was a window into the private struggles of the royal family that the public had never been allowed to see. Camilla shifted slightly in her seat, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She had spent years learning to support Charles through the demands of public life, learning to be the steady presence that allowed him to fulfill his role as king. But this was uncharted territory. She could sense that her husband was moving towards something significant, something that might require her to choose between her own comfort and his need to speak his truth. The pressures we place on those we love in the name of duty can sometimes create distances that serve no one, Charles said, and now his voice carried a slight tremor that spoke of personal experience, of his own memories of feeling trapped between expectation and authentic emotion. Today, I want to speak not as your king, but as a father, as a grandfather, as someone who has learned that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply acknowledge when someone we love is struggling. Kate's eyes filled with tears that she fought desperately to control. The cameras caught the moment, the slight shine in her eyes that spoke of emotions held too tightly for too long. Beside her, William's breathing had become careful and controlled, the way it did when he was working very hard not to let his feelings show. The Archbishop was now looking genuinely concerned, uncertain whether he should intervene somehow or allow this unprecedented moment to continue. But something in Charles's bearing, some quality of absolute conviction, kept him in his seat. Whatever was happening here, it was clearly something that needed to happen. "Catherine," Charles said, and the use of her full name, spoken with such gentle warmth, caused a visible ripple through the congregation. "You have brought joy and authenticity to our family in ways that words cannot capture. But I fear that in our eagerness to share you with the world, we may have forgotten to ask what you need from us." The words hung in the air like a benediction and a confession all at once. Kate's careful composure finally cracked, a single tear escaping despite all her training. She looked up at her father-in-law with an expression of such profound gratitude that it was almost painful to witness. For years, she had been the perfect royal wife, smiling through endless engagements, never complaining, never showing the strain that came with constant public scrutiny. But, in this moment, she was simply a young woman who had been carrying too much for too long. William turned toward his wife, protocol forgotten in the face of her tears. His hand finally moved to cover hers, the gesture small but profound in its defiance of the invisible rules that governed their public behavior. The entire hall watched as the future king chose his wife's emotional well-being over the requirements of royal composure. Charles saw the moment of connection between his son and daughter-in-law, and something loosened in his chest that he hadn't even realized was tight. This was what he had been reaching for, this moment of authentic human connection in the midst of all the ceremony and tradition. "I have watched my son grow into a remarkable man," Charles continued, his voice now rich with pride and emotion. "But I have also watched him struggle with the weight of expectation in ways that are perhaps too familiar to me. Today, I want him to know that strength is not found in carrying burdens alone. It is found in the courage to reach for the support that love offers." The congregation had become more than silent. They had become witnesses to something sacred. In churches and living rooms around the world, people leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that they were seeing something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. This wasn't just a royal event anymore. It was a moment of pure humanity unfolding in real time. Camilla made a choice in that moment that surprised even herself. Rising slowly from her seat, she moved not toward the exit or toward some safe middle ground, but toward Charles. Not to stop him or redirect him, but to stand beside him in whatever this moment was becoming. Her movement was small but significant, a wife choosing to support her husband's truth even when she couldn't predict where it would lead. The gesture was not lost on Charles. As Camilla took her place beside him, he felt a surge of gratitude for her willingness to step into the unknown with him. Together, they presented an image that was unprecedented in royal history, a king and queen consort speaking not from the distance of their roles, but from the intimacy of their shared understanding of what it meant to love people who live their lives in the public eye. "William and Catherine," Charles said, looking directly at them now. "You have our love, you have our support, and you have our permission to be human, even when the world is watching." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of revolution. In a single sentence, Charles had given his son and daughter-in-law something that had been nearly impossible to find in their public roles: permission to acknowledge their struggles, to be imperfect, to need help. Kate was crying openly now, her tears a release of pressure that had been building for years. William's arm was around her shoulders, his own eyes bright with emotion. The image they presented was one of vulnerability and strength intertwined, of two people choosing to be real with each other despite the hundreds of cameras capturing every moment. The silence in the Abbey was profound, broken only by the soft sounds of Kate's tears and the whispered breaths of a congregation that had just witnessed something they would never forget. In that silence, everyone present understood that they had been given a gift, a glimpse into the human hearts that beat beneath the royal titles, a reminder that even those who seem to have everything still need love, understanding, and permission to be authentically themselves. Charles looked out over the congregation one more time, then made another choice that no one could have predicted. Instead of returning to his seat, instead of attempting to restore the formal order of the service, he stepped down from the lectern and walked directly toward his family. As he moved through the aisle, every step was a decision to prioritize love over protocol, connection over control. Every step Charles took toward the front pew seemed to stretch time itself. The congregation watched in absolute silence as their king abandoned every convention that had governed royal behavior for centuries. The ancient stones of Westminster Abbey had witnessed countless ceremonies, but nothing quite like this moment when protocol dissolved in the face of pure human need. Kate's tears had become a steady stream now, years of carefully controlled emotion finally finding release. She had spent so long being the perfect royal wife, smiling through exhaustion, maintaining composure in situations that would have broken most people, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be simply herself. William's arm tightened around her shoulders, his own breathing rough with the effort of maintaining any semblance of control. As Charles reached their pew, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the formal acknowledgement that protocol would have demanded, instead of the careful distance that royal etiquette required, he did something that sent shock waves through the watching world. He reached past William, past all the invisible barriers that had been constructed around royal behavior, and he reached for Kate. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely outside the bounds of what anyone could have predicted, that for a moment nobody moved. Charles's hand extended toward his daughter-in-law with the same natural instinct that any father might show toward a child in distress. It wasn't calculated or considered. It was pure instinct, the response of someone who had watched a loved one struggle for too long. Kate looked up at him through her tears, her eyes wide with surprise, and something that looked like hope. For just an instant, she hesitated, decades of training about proper behavior warring with her desperate need for comfort and understanding. The entire hall held its breath as they watched this internal struggle play out across her face. Then, in a movement that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come, Kate reached back. Her hand met Charles's, and, in that simple contact, something fundamental shifted in the royal family's public face. Here was a king offering comfort not as a duty or a performance, but as a genuine expression of love and concern. The touch lasted only moments, but its impact was seismic. Around the Abbey, people began to realize that they were witnessing something unprecedented in royal history. This wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was a redefinition of what it meant to be human in the most public of lives. Camilla, still standing beside the lectern, felt tears prick her own eyes. She had learned to love Charles's children as her own, had watched Kate struggle with the same pressures that had once nearly destroyed Diana. In this moment, she saw her husband choosing compassion over convention, and her heart swelled with pride and fear in equal measure. William seemed frozen, caught between his ingrained training and his overwhelming relief at seeing his wife receive the support she so desperately needed. For years, he had watched Kate carry burdens that were sometimes too heavy, had seen her smile through situations that would have broken most people. He had wanted to protect her, to shield her from the worst of the pressures, but the constraints of their public role had made that nearly impossible. Now, watching his father reach out to his wife with such genuine care, William felt something break open in his chest. It was permission, he realized. Permission to acknowledge that they were struggling, permission to need help, permission to be human even when the whole world was watching. Charles, still holding Kate's hand, spoke quietly enough that only the family could hear. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "None of us do. We're family first, royals second. The words were revolutionary in their simplicity. For generations, the royal family had operated under the assumption that duty came before everything else, that personal needs must be sublimated to the requirements of the crown. But, in this moment, Charles was articulating a different truth, that their humanity was more important than their titles, that love was more essential than protocol. Kate squeezed his hand, unable to speak, but managing a small nod of understanding. The gesture conveyed more than words could: gratitude, relief, and the beginning of hope that perhaps she didn't have to be perfect all the time, that perhaps it was okay to need support. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every nuance of this extraordinary moment. In newsrooms around the world, editors were already beginning to understand that they had footage of something that would change the conversation about the royal family forever. This wasn't just news, it was history being made in real time. But the moment was far from over. As Charles released Kate's hand, as he prepared to step back and somehow restore order to the service, another choice presented itself. William was sitting there, his face tight with his own carefully controlled emotions, his entire posture speaking of years of carrying burdens that were perhaps too heavy for anyone to bear alone. Without thinking, without calculating the implications, Charles reached for his son as well. His hand settled on William's shoulder, a gesture so natural and fatherly that it seemed to bypass every rule that had ever governed royal behavior. The touch was gentle but firm, a father's hand offering strength and solidarity to his child. William's composure finally cracked completely. The future king, the man who had been trained from birth to never show weakness in public, began to cry. The tears came slowly at first, then, more freely, years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. His training told him to stop, to regain control, to remember where he was and who was watching. But his father's hand on his shoulder and his wife's fingers intertwined with his created a circle of support that made vulnerability feel safe for the first time in years. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the future king allowed himself to be human. Some shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to process this deviation from everything they thought they knew about royal behavior. Others leaned forward, drawn in by the raw authenticity of what they were witnessing. But all of them understood that they were seeing something extraordinary, something that would be remembered long after the formal words of the service were forgotten. In that moment, Camilla made another choice that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped down from beside the lectern and moved toward the family group, not to interrupt or redirect, but to complete the circle of support that Charles had initiated. As she placed her hand gently on William's other shoulder, the royal family presented an image that no one could have imagined. For people choosing vulnerability over invincibility, choosing each other over the expectations of the watching world. The archbishop, who had been wrestling with whether to intervene, found himself moved by what he was witnessing. Here, in the sacred space that had seen centuries of royal ceremonies, he was watching something that spoke to the deepest truths about love, family, and what it meant to support each other through difficult times. After a moment of internal struggle, he too stepped forward, not to restore order, but to offer his own quiet blessing to this moment of authentic human connection. In the midst of our service to others, he said softly, his voice just loud enough to carry through the microphones, we must remember that we too need care, need love, need the support of those who understand our struggles. What we witness here today is not a departure from duty, but perhaps its highest expression, the courage to love each other honestly, even when the world is watching. His words seemed to give everyone permission to understand what they were seeing not as a breakdown of royal protocol, but as a breakthrough to something deeper and more meaningful. The silence in the abbey shifted from shocked uncertainty to something closer to reverence, as hundreds of people began to comprehend that they were witnessing an act of profound love and courage. Charles looked around at his family, his hand still on William's shoulder, his heart full of a mixture of fear and fierce protectiveness. He had broken every rule in the royal playbook, had exposed his family's vulnerabilities to the scrutiny of the world. But, looking at Kate's grateful tears, at William's overwhelming relief, at Camilla's steady support, he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. The service would have to continue somehow. The formal business of the day would have to be addressed. But something fundamental had changed in that moment. The royal family had chosen to be human in the most public possible way, and in doing so, they had offered something precious to everyone watching, permission to be imperfect, to need help, to reach for love even when it meant abandoning the safety of established expectations. As the cameras continued to capture every moment, as millions of people around the world leaned closer to their televisions and phones, Charles made one more choice. He looked directly into the nearest camera, his eyes bright with tears and fierce with determination. "This is what family means," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphones that had been meant to amplify his prepared speech. "This is what love looks like. And this is what we choose, today and always." The words would echo around the world within hours, shared and discussed and debated in every language on earth. But, in that moment, they were simply the truth of a father's heart, spoken with the courage that comes from placing love above all other considerations. The immediate aftermath of Charles's unprecedented words felt like the moment after lightning strikes, when the air itself seems to vibrate with electricity. The congregation sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. Some of the older members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces reflecting decades of conditioning about proper royal behavior. Others, particularly the younger attendees, seemed transfixed by the raw authenticity of what they had seen. Charles remained beside his family, his hand still resting protectively on William's shoulder. The gesture had become a statement of intent, a visible declaration that he was choosing his role as father over his obligations as king. The weight of that choice was beginning to settle around him like a cloak, heavy with implications he was only starting to understand. Kate had managed to regain some composure, though her eyes remained bright with tears. She looked up at Charles with an expression of profound gratitude, mixed with something that might have been awe. In all her years of marriage to William, through all the challenging moments and public pressures, she had never expected this level of support from her father-in-law. The royal family was not known for public displays of vulnerability or emotional support, yet here was the king himself, standing before hundreds of witnesses and declaring that love mattered more than protocol. William wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so ordinary and human that it seemed almost revolutionary in this setting. The future king was not supposed to cry in public, was not supposed to show weakness or need comfort from his father. But the relief on his face was unmistakable, the visible lifting of a burden he had been carrying for years. The archbishop approached the small family group, his movements careful and respectful. He had been wrestling with how to proceed, how to honor both the significance of what had just occurred and the needs of the service that still needed to be completed. His solution was characteristically thoughtful. "Your Majesty," he said quietly to Charles, "perhaps we might observe a moment of prayer for all families who struggle to balance duty with love, obligation with authenticity." The suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity. It provided a way to acknowledge what had just happened while giving the service a path forward. Charles nodded gratefully, understanding that the archbishop was offering him a bridge between the extraordinary moment they had just shared and the practical reality of completing the formal ceremony. "Please join me in prayer," the archbishop said, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient space. The congregation rose as one, their movement creating a rustling sound that seemed to release some of the tension that had been building in the hall. As heads bowed throughout the abbey, Charles found himself genuinely praying for the first time in years. Not the formal, ritualized prayers of state occasions, but something deeper and more personal. He prayed for Kate, that she might find peace with the impossible demands of her role. He prayed for William, that his son might learn to carry the weight of his future responsibilities without losing himself in the process. He prayed for Camilla, who had supported his unprecedented choice without hesitation. And he prayed for wisdom, for the strength to navigate whatever consequences might flow from this moment. When the prayer concluded, a new energy seemed to fill the space. The congregation settled back into their seats, but there was a different quality to their attention now. They were no longer simply witnessing a formal royal ceremony. They were participating in something more meaningful, something that spoke to the universal human experiences of love, struggle, and the need for authentic connection. Charles returned to the lectern, leaving his prepared speech where he had set it aside. Instead, he spoke from the heart about the true meaning of service, about the courage it takes to remain human while fulfilling public duties, and about the importance of supporting each other through the challenges that life inevitably brings. His words were simple but powerful, free of the formal language that typically characterized royal speeches. "We are all navigating the tension between who we are expected to be and who we truly are," he said, looking out over the faces turned toward him. Today, in this sacred place, we choose authenticity. We choose love. We choose each other. The congregation listened with rapt attention, many visibly moved by the unexpected intimacy of the king's words. This wasn't the distant, ceremonial figure they were accustomed to seeing in public appearances. This was a man speaking from deep personal experience about struggles they could all understand. As Charles concluded his remarks, something remarkable happened. Instead of the polite, measured applause that typically followed royal speeches, the congregation erupted in something much more genuine. People were on their feet, clapping with real enthusiasm and emotion. Some were crying. Others were smiling through tears of their own. The response went on for several minutes, a spontaneous outpouring of appreciation for the courage the royal family had shown. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source. In the third row, an elderly woman who had survived the London Blitz and lived through decades of royal ceremonies stood slowly and began to clap. Her weathered hands moved together with deliberate purpose, and her face shone with something that looked very much like pride. Others noticed her response and began to follow suit, until the entire congregation was giving the royal family a standing ovation unlike any in royal history. The service concluded with a hymn that seemed to carry new meaning after what they had all witnessed. Voices rose together in harmony, but there was an added warmth to the singing, a sense of community and shared humanity that transcended the formal boundaries that usually characterized such occasions. As the royal family processed out of the abbey, the atmosphere was electric with excitement and possibility. The crowds outside had sensed that something significant had occurred, though they wouldn't fully understand what until the footage began circulating on social media and news outlets around the world. The car ride back to the palace passed in relative quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts about what had just transpired. Kate sat beside William, their hands clasped together in a gesture of mutual support and solidarity. Camilla watched the London streets pass by, her mind already working through the practical implications of what Charles had chosen to do. But Charles himself was surprisingly calm. The fear he had expected to feel about breaking royal protocol was absent, replaced by a deep sense of rightness about the choice he had made. He had prioritized his family's well-being over institutional expectations, and whatever consequences might follow, he knew in his heart that it had been the correct decision. The first indication of how the world would respond came even before they reached the palace. Charles's private secretary, traveling in a following car, was already fielding calls and messages from news organizations, Commonwealth officials, and royal correspondents around the globe. The footage was being shared and reshared on social media at an unprecedented rate, with millions of people responding to the raw authenticity they had witnessed. Within hours, the moment when Charles reached for Kate would become one of the most viewed royal videos in internet history. But more than that, it would spark a global conversation about family, duty, mental health, and the courage required to choose love over convention. Child psychologists would praise the king for modeling emotional support and vulnerability. Marriage counselors would cite the moment as an example of healthy family dynamics. Mental health advocates would celebrate the public acknowledgement that even those in positions of privilege and power sometimes struggle and need support. But perhaps the most meaningful responses came from ordinary people around the world who saw something of their own family struggles reflected in what the royals had shared. Parents dealing with children under pressure, couples navigating difficult times, anyone who had ever felt caught between expectation and authenticity found something valuable in the king's choice to prioritize love over protocol. The palace staff was working frantically to manage the unprecedented response, but Charles had given strict instructions that no attempts should be made to downplay or explain away what had occurred. This had been a deliberate choice, not a momentary lapse of judgment, and he wanted the world to understand that. As evening approached and the initial shock began to wear off, Charles found himself in his private study with Camilla, William, and Kate. The formal obligations of the day were complete, but the real work was just beginning. They needed to discuss how to move forward, how to build on this moment of authenticity rather than retreating from it. "I want you to know," Charles said, looking at each of them in turn, "that I have no regrets about what happened today. None at all." Kate smiled through fresh tears, her hand finding William's again. "It was the first time in years that I felt like I could breathe," she admitted. "Like I was allowed to be human instead of just a role." William nodded, his voice rough with emotion when he spoke. I never realized how much I needed to hear that it was okay to struggle, okay to need help. Thank you, Dad. For all of us. Camilla, ever practical, was already thinking about the days and weeks to come. The response has been extraordinary, she reported. Overwhelmingly positive, but also intense. We'll need to be thoughtful about how we handle the follow-up. Charles stood and moved to the window, looking out over the grounds where he had played as a child, where his own sons had grown up, where his grandchildren now ran, and laughed with the freedom he was trying to create space for in their public lives as well. We've opened a door, he said quietly. There's no going back now, even if we wanted to. The question is, how do we walk through it together? The conversation that followed would last well into the evening, as four people who had committed their lives to public service tried to figure out how to balance authenticity with responsibility, how to remain human while fulfilling roles that seemed to require superhuman perfection. But the foundation had been laid. In one extraordinary moment in Westminster Abbey, the royal family had chosen love over convention, vulnerability over invincibility, and, in doing so, they had given permission for everyone watching to make similar choices in their own lives. 6 months after that transformative moment in Westminster Abbey, the world had begun to settle into a new understanding of what the royal family could be. The initial media frenzy had given way to something more sustainable, a genuine shift in how the public related to the monarchy and how the monarchy related to itself. Charles stood in the same private study where the family had gathered that evening after the service, but the atmosphere was entirely different now. Gone was the tension that had once characterized family meetings, replaced by something that felt remarkably like peace. The changes hadn't been easy or immediate, but they had been profound. Kate was scheduled to give a speech that afternoon at a mental health conference, the first time she would speak publicly about the struggles she had experienced and the support that had made all the difference. The old Kate would have been terrified, worried about saying the wrong thing or revealing too much. But the woman preparing for this appearance moved with a confidence that came from knowing she was supported, knowing that authenticity was valued over perfection. I keep thinking about how different this feels, she confided to Charles as they reviewed her speech notes together. It had become a new tradition, these moments of genuine consultation where her perspective was sought not because protocol demanded it, but because her insights were genuinely valued. Different how? Charles asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Before, I felt like I was always performing, always trying to be what I thought people expected. Now I feel like I can just be myself, and somehow that's enough. She paused, looking out the window where William was playing with their children in the garden, his laughter carrying clearly through the glass. Actually, it's more than enough. It's better. The changes in William had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. The future king had begun speaking openly about his own struggles with anxiety and the pressure of his role. Rather than diminishing his stature in the public eye, his honesty had made him more beloved than ever. People respected authenticity, it turned out, far more than they respected distant perfection. Camilla appeared in the doorway, her face bright with the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing a difficult gamble pay off beautifully. The response to the conference announcement has been extraordinary, she reported. They've had to move it to a larger venue 3 times. And the applications for the new Royal Fellowship program are pouring in. The fellowship program had been Kate's idea, born from her experience of feeling isolated and unsupported during her most difficult periods. It would bring together young people from across the Commonwealth who were struggling with mental health challenges, providing them with mentorship, resources, and, most importantly, a community of people who understood what they were going through. It's funny, Kate mused. 6 months ago I was terrified that people would think less of me if they knew I sometimes struggled. Now the fact that I struggled seems to be exactly what makes me useful to others. Charles felt a surge of pride so strong, it was almost physical. This was what he had hoped for when he made that impossible choice in Westminster Abbey, though he could never have predicted exactly how it would unfold. By giving his family permission to be human, he had unleashed something powerful and healing that was rippling out far beyond their own lives. The afternoon of Kate's speech arrived with unusual fanfare. The media attention was intense, but it felt different from the old days when every public appearance had been scrutinized for signs of perfection or imperfection. Now there was a sense of genuine curiosity about what she might share, a feeling that whatever she said would be worth hearing because it would be real. Charles and Camilla sat in the front row of the conference hall, with William beside them. The sight of the royal family attending not as distant dignitaries, but as engaged family members supporting one of their own had become a powerful symbol of the new approach they were pioneering. When Kate took the stage, she looked out over an audience of mental health professionals, advocates, and individuals who had their own experiences with struggle and healing. Her opening words were simple but profound. I want to talk to you today not as a royal, but as someone who has learned that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but perhaps the greatest act of courage any of us can perform. She spoke for 30 minutes about her journey, about the isolation she had felt, about the moment when Charles reached out to her in Westminster Abbey, and everything changed. She talked about the importance of family support, about the power of admitting vulnerability, and about the extraordinary things that could happen when people chose authenticity over appearance. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when she departed from her prepared remarks to address something that had been weighing on her heart. 6 months ago, I thought my value came from never making mistakes, from always being composed and appropriate and perfect. I was wrong. My value comes from my willingness to be honest about my struggles so that others feel less alone in theirs. I am more useful to the world as an imperfect human being who cares deeply than I ever was as a perfect symbol who felt nothing. The standing ovation that followed went on for nearly 5 minutes, but it was the quiet conversations afterward that mattered most. Person after person approached Kate to share their own stories, to thank her for her courage, to express how much it meant to see someone in her position acknowledge the reality of mental health struggles. Charles watched these interactions with a full heart, understanding that this was the real measure of success. His choice to break protocol had created space for thousands of other people to feel less alone, less ashamed, more supported in their own journeys toward healing and authenticity. The drive home passed in comfortable silence, each family member processing the day in their own way. But as they pulled through the palace gates, William broke the quiet with a question that had been building for months. Dad, do you think we've changed things permanently, or will it all go back to the old way eventually? Charles considered the question carefully before answering. I think we've given people permission to expect something different from us and from themselves. That's not the kind of thing you can take back easily. And do you want to take it back? Kate asked, now that you've seen how much work it is to be this honest all the time. Charles smiled, thinking of the hundreds of letters they had received from people around the world sharing their own stories of struggle and healing. Not for a moment, he said firmly. This is who we were always meant to be. We just needed the courage to become it. That evening, as had become their custom, the family gathered for dinner without staff or protocol, just 4 people who had learned to love each other's humanity more than they feared the world's judgment. The conversation ranged from serious discussions about upcoming engagements to silly jokes about the children's latest adventures, but underlying it all was a sense of ease that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. As they prepared to part ways for the evening, Charles found himself thinking about the moment in Westminster Abbey that had started it all. The decision to reach for Kate instead of maintaining royal distance seemed like it had happened in another lifetime, though he could still remember the exact feeling of choosing love over protocol. Thank you, Kate said quietly, approaching him before he could retreat to his study, for giving us permission to be human, for showing us that love could be more important than rules. Charles hugged his daughter-in-law, still marveling at how natural such gestures had become. Thank you for being brave enough to accept that permission, and for using it to help so many others find their own courage. Later that night, alone in his study, Charles received a phone call that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. It was from a man in Australia whose teenage daughter had been struggling with severe anxiety. After watching Kate's speech that day, the girl had finally agreed to seek professional help. I just wanted you to know, the man said, his voice thick with emotion, that your family's courage to be real probably saved my daughter's life. She's been suffering in silence for 2 years, but seeing Princess Catherine speak so honestly about her own struggles made my daughter realize that it was okay to ask for help. As Charles hung up the phone, he understood with perfect clarity that the choice he had made in Westminster Abbey had been about so much more than his own family. It had been about giving permission for everyone who was watching to choose authenticity over performance, vulnerability over invincibility, love over fear. The silence that had filled Westminster Abbey in that extraordinary moment had indeed echoed around the world. But, rather than empty silence, it had become a space filled with possibility, with the understanding that even the most public lives could be lived with genuine humanity, and that sometimes the most powerful thing any of us can do is simply reach out and offer love when someone needs it most. In the months and Years that would follow, the royal family would face new challenges and public scrutiny, as all families do. But they would face them with a foundation of authenticity and mutual support that made them stronger individually and collectively. The moment when Charles reached for Kate had been the beginning of something new, not just for the monarchy, but for everyone who had witnessed it and chosen to embrace their own humanity with greater courage as a result. The hall had gone silent, but the world had learned to speak a new language of love, support, and authentic connection. And that conversation would continue for generations to come, all because one father chose to reach for his daughter-in-law when she needed him most. Protocol be damned.